Thank you for everybody for joining us for our Woods and for Nature seminar. My name's Caroline Sinclair and I'm from the Forestry Commission. And joining us today is Simon Needle, who's the Principal Arboriculturist, I can't even pronounce this word, Arboriculturist and Principal Ecologist from Birmingham City Council. I'll hand over to Simon in a moment or two, but just to quickly run through how the webinar will work today, and to let you all know it is being recorded, so we will be sending it out when we're finished. Simon's presentation will last for about 20 minutes, after which I'll briefly go through a couple of slides that run through our grants and the support that's available for woodland creation. We'll then move on to a Q&A session. So if you would like to ask any questions, please do put them into the Q&A channel where we will publish them. Also on the call today is Jo Garlick, who's one of our business development advisors. She'll try and answer any of our general sort of forestry commission or forestry type questions as we go along, and she'll put those answers in the Q&A. And we'll also ask some specific questions relating to Simon's presentation at the end. To try and make sure that we get through as many of your key questions as possible, if you see any in the chat, in the Q&A that you're particularly interested in, please can you just like them, and we will use that as an indicator of the questions to go through first. We'll try and prioritise in that order. And finally, just as I've mentioned before, we will share the slide deck and the recording at the end. Occasionally we get a little bit of a delay when switching between presenters and slides, so don't worry if there is a slight delay when we're switching over. That's just the nature of Teams Live. So thank you, that's our intro. I'll now go over and hand over to Simon, please.
Thank you very much, Caroline. Hopefully we'll get the first slide up in a second. So yes, good morning everybody. My name, as Caroline said, is Simon Needle. I'm Principal Arboriculturist and Ecologist within Birmingham City Council. I actually sit within the city's planning teams, so we deal with a lot with the planning side of things, applications, but we also look more strategically across our tree and woodland policy and try and see where we can deliver more trees for climate and nature across the whole city. We've been lucky enough over the last year to be awarded Queen's Green Canopy Champion City status for the work we were doing around planting trees for the Platinum Jubilee and the work with schools that we've done. And we've also held the United Nations Tree Cities of the World accreditation since its start in 2019. So that again is recognising some of the work that we've been doing around urban forestry and engaging with the community there. So yeah, just a little bit of background from us. So can I have the next slide, please? I think it's always interesting to start with a bit of background about the city and some of the challenges that we have. Just like many urban areas, we have a lot of challenges to deal with. We have a population of 1.1 million people and rising, one of the youngest populations in Europe. A significant number of our wards are within the top 10 percentile for the in-season multiple deprivation, so that we have quite a lot of deprived wards. We have high levels of years life lost in certain sectors of the city as well, which is associated with that multiple deprivation, but also linked into air pollution, urban heat island, flood risk, both from rivers bursting, but also surface water flooding. And we have a very high demand for housing as well. So I think, you know, we're looking forward over the next sort of 15-20 years. We've got a huge demand for housing, of which we don't necessarily have a full land supply. So competition for land resources is incredibly steep within the city boundary itself. The COVID-19 pandemic obviously brought to the fore the inequality in accessible green space. So there are certain areas of the city where we know that green space is of limited supply compared with the levels of population, and that certainly has been more noticeable in those areas where we have high levels of ethnic minority populations as well. So they were definitely more adversely impacted by the pandemic and that ability to get out into green space. And that again ties with those poor air quality areas and urban heat island, and the two maps that we've got there are trying to illustrate that. So the one is showing urban heat island predictions from back in 2006, showing that the central portion of the city there is particularly impacted for urban heat island effect, with a few local centres where there was some larger manufacturing or there's higher residential populations there. And then the right-hand map is showing what we call our multi-challenge map. So that was looking at demands for ecosystem services, so things like air cooling from trees and green space, and the demand and the supply. So we've got areas. So in the north of the map, there's a big white space where there's a very high supply. That's Sutton Park, our National Nature Reserve, 2,500 acre site. So there's a big supply of ecosystem services from there. But there's a very low demand from the local residents around there, because there's nobody living in that park, so it's all centered around the outside. Can I have the next slide, please? So the next thing then I wanted to take a look at is looking at our canopy cover levels across the city. This is talking about woods for nature, and a lot of people think about creating a woodland maybe on a piece of land or in isolation, but I suppose we're looking at our city as a whole. So we've been looking at canopy cover, and we've got a number of maps here showing it at constituency level and ward level on this one, and this is taken from the UK's national tree map from Blue Sky. So we've taken the land area, but we've taken out things like water bodies and key sporting facilities as being sort of available land for tree planting. So that's given us a canopy cover across our total land area of somewhere between 18 and 20%. But you can see that it's not evenly distributed there. The darker green it is, the higher the canopy cover. So we've got areas as much as sort of like 49% canopy cover, right the way down to areas down below 10% on there. And you can see as we move through the sections from constituency to ward, we're getting a more intricate breakdown of that. And then if we move to the next slide, please. On the next one, we actually move down as far as the lowest super output areas. So we've got 10 constituencies, 69 wards, and then 639 lowest super output areas. So if we look into those there, we can see that even on this breakdown here, we can see that there's significant variation between the areas around the city. Do you need me to hold for a minute? Are you okay? There's a question out there. It's okay. We can see that there's significant variation in the canopy cover there. We've got, even in the areas where we had high canopy cover, we still have some areas which are particularly lower in coverage. So this sort of is guiding us, I suppose, about where we might need to be looking at doing tree or woodland planting as part of a programme of managing and enhancing the urban forest as a whole. So if we can go to the next slide, please. Thanks. So yeah, so we were just talking about the canopy cover as a whole there, and I think we often talk about Birmingham and people don't think about how green it is, but we do sort of see it as an urban forest. And if we think about what an urban forest is, or as a description of an urban forest, it's an ecosystem containing all the trees, plants and associated animals in the urban environment, both in and around the city. And the United Nations definition of a forest is land with tree crown cover of more than 10% and an area greater than half a hectare. So I suppose at the city size of being 26,780 hectares with 20% canopy cover, we don't really have, I suppose we don't really have woods necessarily, but in a city, but we have a city within a forest, although we do recognise the fact that we do have areas that we call woodland within the city, but actually as a whole we are pretty I suppose pretty tree covered across the city. Next slide, please. So I suppose this is where we get on to, I suppose, the theme about what I was asked to talk about, which was woods for nature. And during that discussion, I was sort of saying, well, we do plant woods for nature and we do plant trees for nature, but actually for us, it's just as significantly about climate as well. So we're trying to see how we can tie those two things together. And you can see, we've already seen what some of those challenges were. So if we just move on to our next slide. So here what we've done is we've taken that urban canopy cover map and we've actually overlaid it with a whole series of other data sets as well. We've overlaid it with our indices of multiple deprivation. We've actually broken those out into individual data sets, but we've also overlaid with our most up-to-date air quality data, our urban heat island data, our surface water and river flooding data, and then we've done an analysis using Ordnance Survey master map, the green space master map, to look at what is our potential plantable space as well. So from this, we've produced a map that we can use to prioritize areas for planting. So we can weight a particular aspect of that. So we might say, well, we're going to pick areas with lowest canopy coverage. We want to also target areas that have highest urban heat island. And from that, the map there, it's actually still at lower super output area, shows us all those areas that meet those criteria and are the most suitable for us looking at that kind of green space intervention there. So those are highlighted in red. And within there, we can actually get some little details out there. We can see what is a priority within there. So the little inset there shows how much sort of plantable space there is, how much impermeable surface there is, whether it's a higher, whether it's particularly poor for surface water flooding or air quality. So that's the little symbols in that square map there. And we can also limit our view as well by selecting that we want to look at just those sites that are most suitable for delivering on the criteria or the priorities that we've set in there. So we can bring that down and just focus on those lower super output areas that are highest priority. But that's just half the story. That's just looking at climate vulnerability and risk and climate adaptation. So if we move on to the next slide, this is where we get into our space, our delivery for nature comes in as well. So hopefully many of you will be aware that the Environment Act was brought into force in November 21. And with that comes, or with that, when we get secondary legislation, will come the requirement for local nature recovery networks and also biodiversity net gain. And those will be delivered through things like planning. So where we're getting biodiversity impacts from planning developments, we'll be having to see mitigation for those impacts plus an additional 10%. So where would that enhancement be being delivered? Well, primarily it would be on the development sites, but where it can't be delivered on site, we need to have a network of ecological spaces sort of mapped out on a sort of larger strategic scale to show where those enhancements would best be placed in order to increase the ecological connectivity of those sites. So this is a map of Birmingham that we have at the moment. This shows our 25-year nature recovery vision. And we can see that we've got some large spaces which have got some core habitat zones in. Those are the dark green areas on the map. And we've got a number of sites. So we've got the big Sutton Park at the north there, but we've got some linear sites that follow river corridors. And there's one that sort of curves around to the sort of east of that map, coming in at the south and then out to the east. That's the River Cole. So we'll have a look at that in a moment. But you can see we've got a number of different sections here. So we've got the core ecological areas. Those are our areas with our key habitats, our key connectivity for natural environments and for species movements. And then beyond that, we've got sort of some buffer zones, the core expansion zones. We've then got some other sites which are coloured in purple, which are called expansion zone 2, and those would be sort of acting, I suppose, as stepping stone sites. So those of you that remember the Lawton report that came out, the Making Space for Nature, we're looking at making spaces bigger, better and more joined up, and that could be joining those corridors together or joining them together by providing high quality stepping stone sites for species movement across a broader area. And then the remainder of the site there, really, I suppose that's our more dense urban matrix. So that's gardens and other land holdings that are outside of those key ecological areas. They still play a part, but they're not necessarily the main part of our ecological network there. So in thinking about how we relate our tree planting in terms of providing benefits for nature, we're going to look at part of what's that Cole Valley corridor, that piece that comes around on the east there. So if we move to the next slide. There we go. Okay, so in the bottom corner there, we've got a little greyed out map just of that ecological network map, and the red circle there shows the area that we're looking at on that aerial image there. So this is the Coal Valley, and the Coal Valley, this upper section here is 7 kilometres long. The whole thing actually is 14 kilometres from where it enters the city to where it leaves, and it's a big mix really of some recreational amenity sort of spaces, sports pitches, but we also have some quite sort of riverside woodland habitat. We've got some wet woodland, we've got some ancient woodland along there, and then we've got some rough grassland meadows as well throughout the whole length of that. And then actually at the one end we go into some much drier sort of higher land where we've got some heathland as well. So a good mix of habitats along the length of there. Now the habitats we've got some mature trees that were there that probably date back to the agricultural past, but much of the tree planting that's there now occurred in sort of late 70s, early 80s as part of the formation of this green space as well, what's now a country park. But there's still opportunities to improve that matrix for wildlife. So we're looking at how we can deliver tree planting along here to benefit wildlife in terms of its connectivity, in terms of increasing the habitat, increasing opportunities for local residents to have access to woodland areas, but also at the same time looking at how they can play a part in helping things like slow the flow of the river. So where we've got spill out from the river during floods, that will have the additional tree planting on the edges will help slow that flow. Plus also we've got those air cooling and air cleaning effects that woodland will help provide there. So we've already got this matrix of sort of some woodland planting and open amenity grassland and meadows, and here we need to be very careful about where we're placing those, because we don't want to be placing woodland planting over priority habitats. So some of our more richer species rich grasslands that are within that corridor, we want to be making sure we avoid those, and that any woodland is going to complement that by either providing an opportunity to get some ecotones between the two. So we've got staging up through from the open grassland through to sort of a woodland edge through into mature woodland with understory. So here we've been prioritising amenity mown areas that are perhaps less well used. They're not taking out the sporting facilities, but we're still maintaining some open amenity grassland for informal recreation. We're still maintaining sporting facilities, but we are looking at how those habitats can bulk up the pieces that are already there. So we've got, if we're following through from the bottom sort of left hand corner, we've got a few little isolated clumps of trees there alongside the edge of the river, so we can block that piece in there with some walkways through. So we've got a little woodland block on the edge there, the same with the next one up, joining together the woodland, well, the sort of scrub belts on either side. And then moving up into the top one at the north, we're going to put a little bit more of a linear woodland strip there. We've got some nice sort of wet grasslands that border the river there, so we'll be adding some woodland at the back edge of that corridor. If we can move to the next slide, please. So although for us woodland planting is important, we actually are quite tight on space for new woodland planting as a whole. So for us, individual urban trees are just as crucial and integral part of the mix as woodland planting. So this is just one section taken zoomed in from that initial climate and sort of vulnerability risk map that we had earlier. And this shows that we've got some different coloured zones there, and sort of the oranges and yellows that are on there are showing areas that are impacted by things like urban heat island or lower poor air quality, but also have lower urban tree planting. So we can look at these areas in a much more detailed way. We can look for open space within there. We can see what the level of tree planting that's in there, and we can still think about how we can use these spaces to help link existing areas of woodland together across those spaces. Can we actually see connections between woodland areas and woodland blocks? Can we create a bit more of a stepping stone site across there? And yes, while we'll be looking at using native species primarily within those sort of more natural landscape areas, what can we do within these areas here? We need to be thinking about our species mix. We need to be thinking about climate risk vulnerability, pests and diseases. So we can, through careful selection, use a quite wide range of non-native tree species, but still provide significant wildlife benefits. There's loads of species out there that will still be attractive to pollinators, still provide food for birds, still provide, will still function as an ecological unit if we see connectivity between species, things like bat movements, bird movements, etc. So yeah, it's looking really, I suppose, at both woodland units within the urban forest, but also looking at that whole, how can we sort of create those linkages between and use perhaps the gardens as those woodland glades that you might normally see. Can we move on to the next slide, please? Okay, so this was just then a little bit of other data that we can pull out from our mapping software, and this is thinking back to those key benefits that we get from tree and woodland planting. So although obviously part of today is talking about woodland planting and talking about woodland creation grants and what's out there available on the market, I'm also looking at how I can tie those into these climate benefits as well. And it is the funding or funding streams internally that are coming through maybe a climate emergency funding route that you can tie into to support the delivery of and with long-term maintenance of new woodland and tree planting. And so what we're able to do here is we're able to sort of make some predictions about whether we want to increase canopy cover by a percentage or to a given percent. We can think about the average tree size and mortality rates in there, and we can get some estimation of just how many trees we'll be needing to plant in order to deliver on those targets. But as part of that, we're also able to link into things like the iTree ecosystem services as well. So we're able to get a sort of a prediction around what the net benefits will be in terms of carbon sequestration, water interception, air particulate removal. So we can sort of tie that quite nicely into our sort of climate emergency plans to show that we're having a benefit, and hopefully that will lead on to some additional funding for delivery of these urban trees and woodlands that we need to put in. So yeah, it's a very useful tool for us, and certainly it's something that we've been able to engage local communities with, and also our elected members as well. I think they respond very well to these sort of visual mapping systems. They can see at a glance, they know where their wards are, they can see what the issues are quite easily. So we can just move on to the next slide, please. Okay, so I know it's been a bit of a gallop through there on just looking at Birmingham and talking about where we're planting woodlands overall. But certainly, this is just going through, I suppose, some of those considerations about that we're thinking about as we head through this process of creating new woodlands and new tree planting. So the first one I think that was key for us is about identifying those suitable sites that don't compromise priority habitats, or where the matrix of habitats will be improved, including ecotowns. So tying your woodland planting into your local nature recovery network when that gets up and running. Some of you might already be at a position where you have that kind of mapping already done, but for those local authorities that haven't got it, that is something that's going to be coming through. So if you're not tied into that work yet, I strongly suggest that you try and find out who is going to be leading on that within your local authority, because this is a way that you might be able to fund some of your woodland creation. It'll certainly provide potential for income as well if you're looking at biodiversity offsetting and net gain. So yeah, don't compromise priority habitats. Yes, hopefully you should have some mapping that's of your own, but otherwise you can find national mapping on things like Magic as well, which can do that. Thinking about what benefits are being delivered, tying into the climate adaptation and resilience plans. So yeah, I work with our flood resilience team, I work with our climate team, working with the local councillors. How can we tie all these plans together to make sure that we're delivering the biggest amount of benefits? So yes, we've got amenity value of woodlands, we've got wildlife value of woodlands, we've got the climate value of woodlands that can go in. We're prioritising native tree and shrub planting within the local nature recovery networks, because those are the areas that are our core ecological areas. Those are the bits that are going to benefit most from maintaining those native ecosystems there. But outside of the local nature recovery network, we are looking at diversity of species, and that's key for thinking about our climate and pest and disease resilience. So, you know, we're trying to look at what that balance is of, say, trees from Rosaceae family compared to Tiliaceae. You know, how many limes have we got? How many London planes have we got? How many hawthorns have we got? Or you know, that type of thing. Can we use that information to help balance that out? Can we look at the other species that are available? Can we trial new species that actually will provide some biodiversity benefits? So we've got things like hibiscus growing in the city centre, which, you know, the bees have found to be quite good. But you know, something that we wouldn't be planting in our key ecological areas. If you're creating a larger woodland and you're actually doing a big amount of ground prep, one of the things that I've seen or sort of experienced historically from plantings that were done in the 1980s is that we ended up with a very dense woodland, but there was no installation of ground floor as part of that. So you get into those woodlands, and if they're not connected to an existing piece of native woodland that has good ground flora, there's going to be very little in the way of beneficial species in there. So can you introduce some ground flora at the same time as that planting activity? So if you're converting an agricultural field or an open space and you're having it turf stripped, or you're ploughing it over in order to prep it for planting, once it's planted, can you get some kind of ground flora in there? That's going to provide a great benefit short term as well for pollinators. Long-term management, we all know this about how do we fund these long-term managements of these woodlands. So the ones that we are having created on the Coal Valley are actually being accredited under the Woodland Carbon Code. So there'll actually be the opportunity to offset those against carbon emitted. They're part of the Commonwealth Games legacy woodlands. So there is a tie in there. Although we've got the initial period that that Woodland Carbon Code is being tied up for, beyond, I think it's year 35, there's a potential income stream there if we wanted to sell those Woodland Carbon Code credits. Biodiversity gain offsetting as well. Although woodland takes a long time to reach its sort of more ideal, optimal condition, there is an opportunity that if you've got some good quality baseline data in around the habitat conditions and habitat types that if you're creating woodland now, get that registered. Make a note of that now, and then think about whether you can offer that as an offset against some impacts further down the line. It could be attracting the money to offset your original cost, but also 30 years or more worth of maintenance costs. Biosecurity in all its forms as well. So we're thinking about where we're getting our tree species from, where are we purchasing? Are we getting grown in Britain accredited tree species or trees? So going to reputable nurseries is key for us. I think many of us learned our lessons sort of way back in 2010, 11, 12, when you know, we were finding, although we were getting UK native ash trees being supplied to us, that some of those were coming in from Holland. And certainly that's how we seem to acquire ash dieback in Birmingham, was through that infected whipstock coming in from Europe at the time. So yeah, it's really critical, I think, you know, just thinking about everything that's coming forward, just where you're getting your whipstock from, whether it's you securing it or whether it's through a third party. And I think finally the last thing, and I know I was asked to mention this, was, and it's something that we will have to consider as well. So while we don't have, you know, large numbers of rabbits in the city, we do have some in some of the locations, some of the bigger parks. We do have grey squirrel and we do have some deer. The deer particularly are not necessarily in very high numbers, but so damage to the woodlands from the deer is at a fairly low level on the whole. But if we are increasing our woodland areas, if we are increasing our connectivity out into neighbouring counties or into neighbouring local authorities, so for us, our local nature recovery network will have to link in to that of Solihull, Dudley, Worcestershire, for example, and out to Warwickshire. So what's the potential for, if they're also enhancing habitats, creating better connectivity, that we might get slightly increased populations? So we will need to think about how that's working there. So currently we don't use tree guards on our wood plantings, but there may be a need to do that in future. How can we do that sustainability, or do we start thinking about fencing these plantations off? Do we need to think about whether we need to manage populations. Maybe not so much of an issue for a big urban area like us, but for some of the more rural counties, maybe that will be something you need to consider. So I think that's come to my last slide there. So thanks for listening, and if I can hand back over to Caroline for now.
That's great. Thank you, Simon. I'm just going to get the slides to switch over and I can start talking through some of the grants. Thank you for your comments as well in the Q&A. We're putting all those together. So how do you fund some of this activity if you'd like to, if it's something you're interested in? I'm going to skim through really quickly. These slides will be circulated at the end. All the links are in there, so you can go take a look at your leisure. But just quickly to run through, Woodland Creation Planning Grant is a fund that is available to help cover some of the costs of planning woodland before you go ahead and apply for a grant or actually put a spade in the ground. Two grants specifically aimed at local authorities. There's a local authority treescapes fund and also the Urban Tree Challenge Fund. Although both of those are currently closed, they are reopening sometime next year, and both of those do have monies for tree planting outside, the sort of classic forest environment. England Woodland Creation Offer is our flagship grant that's open all year round and funds woodland from as small as 1 hectare in size. Forestry England also have a programme. They have a woodland partnership scheme, which is a lease scheme, which enables local authorities to lease land for woodland creation over to Forestry England. They have a brochure specifically for local authorities, so do take a look at that link. And then the Tree Health Pilot, also open at the moment, is a fund which helps slowing the spread of tree pests and diseases. If we can have the next slide, please, Charlie. The resources, this is some sort of materials that might be helpful to you. Information on the Woodland Creation Planning Grant. Sorry, I'm on the wrong page. Let's go there again. Our guide to New Woodland in England. Another guide to how you can go around creating New England. There's a Woodland Creation Planning Grant leaflet, which is the grant I just mentioned. Information on how to find your local woodland creation officer if you need to get some additional advice. There's the England Woodland Creation Offer leaflet. There are also a number of case studies of local authorities that have gone around about woodland creation, so that might be helpful to you. Next slide, please, Charlie. There's the Forestry England Woodland Partnership brochure that I've just mentioned. There's a leaflet responding to the climate emergency with new trees, which may also be helpful to local authorities. Simon mentioned getting money from the Woodland Carbon Code. There's a Woodland Carbon Code leaflet and also Woodland Carbon Guarantee, which explains how that guarantee works. As a general grants and incentives overview table, which covers quite a lot of these grants, and also the Urban Tree Manual, which gives advice on how to select and procure the right trees and how to manage pests and diseases. So coming up soon, there is a new local authorities tree and woodland strategies toolkit being produced, scheduled to launch during National Tree Week shortly, and that gives step-by-step guidance for local authorities to develop an effective tree and woodland strategy. I mentioned a couple of slides ago the Local Authority Tree Fund and the Urban Tree Challenge Fund, both due to reopen. So to find out when these announcements are going to be made, when these funds are going to be open, if you sign up to receive e-alerts from Forestry Commission, the link is in this slide, then you will receive email updates on all our new grant news and when funds will be open. And finally, the last page here, again, the link to how to find your local woodland creation officer. And if you have sort of more general queries that you want to put to the Forestry Commission, each of our 5 regions has an email address for general support. So feel free to use that if you need more general support and advice. So I'm just going to move on now to some questions. We can get those open. So thank you everybody for your questions. So Simon, I think most of these are going to come in your direction. I'll start with one. A little while ago, apparently Birmingham was quite well known for cutting down quite a lot of streetscape trees in the district. So someone's just wondering how that squares now with the work that you're currently doing.
Yeah, so I was just reading through that question in the Q&A. Okay, right. So I'm trying to think how many years that might be ago. I mean, I've worked for the city now for more years than I care to mention, 30 something odd years now. And for the last 10 or 15 at least, in a sort of more citywide strategic capacity around trees and the landscape. I don't recall that as such. I mean, I know that we have had a number of high profile cases over the years. I mean, we've had trees failing on the highway that have made you know, changes in legislation, and certainly we've been found at fault for a few things, which certainly changed the way that we implement our tree management processes. We did have some issues with things like Birmingham cable when that was going forward, that did cause some, you know, instability of trees, but I don't recall us having a program of actively removing trees. We've had 75,000-80,000 street trees now for quite a number of decades. We have a replanting program that happens every year, so not quite sure on there. I mean, we did have some tree losses in Corporation Street, which stimulated, well, ultimately stimulated the review of our tree policies, which has tightened up our tree practices and has led to the formation of our urban forest master plan. Yeah, sorry, I don't know particularly what you're talking about, but certainly some of the instances of losses that have occurred have led to an improvement in policies and tightening up of how we approve and what we require as replacement.
Thank you, Simon. Another one here, more practical one. Which method do you use to survey canopy cover, and how do you monitor changes year on year?
Okay, so it's a good question, because we've looked at a number of different processes through our urban forest master plan. We actually looked at the forest research ward canopy cover mapping that was being done. One of my colleagues did probably the bulk of Birmingham overnight, over a series of nights. So that was one way of looking at it. We have the Blue Sky National Tree Map as well. A number of different methods, though, have given different results in canopy cover extent, which I think was interesting. So at the moment, we're moving forward with just using the Blue Sky National Tree Map. We can't necessarily monitor year on year, but we have I think it's 4 or 5 sets of National Tree Map data now, so we can show some changes in canopy cover over that period. I think they come out around every 3 years, so that's how we've got them in our current mapping. We have 2 showing at any one time, so we've got 2016 and 2019 showing at the moment. We're just about to put the 2022 National Tree Map into our system, so that will be how we move forward. We're going to make sure that we've now, once we've set on a method of assessing, we're going to carry on in the same vein. I think the only thing I will caution against there is that even with the National Tree Map using the same data set year on year, I think we'll see that there are improvements in photography and imagery, and the fact that for urban areas they'll be starting to use things like oblique photography may show an increase in canopy cover just because they're picking up more trees, or it might show a decrease in canopy cover because they're ruling stuff out that they've classified previously as trees and now see that they're not. They are large shrubs on tops of buildings. I think whichever method you go with, I think if you stick with the same method of assessment year on year and just be aware of their sort of pros and cons. But yeah, I think that at the moment we're going to be using National Tree Map for us.
Thank you, Simon. how did you get all your data for the impermeable ground, etc., to give you that full scope for planting? Is that all in-house data?
Okay, so we have a license for the Ordnance Survey Green Space Master Map, which shows, I think they've used NVDI, whichever way around the letters are, to show areas of soft landscaping and hard landscaping. We're also overlaying that then on things like our road network, so you can use the data sets that you've got and the polygons that are available to include and exclude certain areas. So certainly we looked at all the soft landscaping. We then went through a series of sort of, I suppose, a rationale to decide which areas of soft landscaping we were going to include or exclude in terms of plantable space. So things like school grounds, school playing fields we excluded from plantable space. But yes, anything else that was impermeable landscape, I think, came from that Ordnance Survey Green Space Master Map, excluding things like our highways network, so the main road spaces.
One here about the types of trees you're planting. In fact, there's two questions here. I'm tempted to link them together because they're not a million miles apart. For woodland planting, what proportion of native species are you using? And are you using local provinces or something more applicable to projected climate? And a similar but different, can you name some of the suitable non-native and native tree species that have worked well for you, please?
Okay, right, yeah. So within our woodland plantings, so within the local nature recovery network areas, we'll be using all native species. So that'll be everything. We might, depending on what the locations are like, we'll be using oak, wild cherry, alder, willows, hornbeam, beech in some locations as well. Some locations we might also put some pine in there as well, if that sort of suits the local environment. But then we'll also include things like spindle and hazel and hawthorn, holly, all of those understory species and woodland edge species as well. So normally the woodland mix is something around, I suppose with the shrub species, we're probably looking around 35, 32 species or something, I think we're putting into the woodland mixes. So the way that they fit into those blocks varies. I think we've always looked to try and get trees grown as locally as possible. I mean, obviously we're at the mercy of the nursery, where the nurseries are located, but we can get trees grown. We know that we can get grown in Britain accredited tree species. I think it's interesting to think about what nursery is going to do in terms of how they deliver native tree species going forward. Are we going to be looking at them securing a percentage of their seed source from maybe latitudes, maybe sort of 5 degrees where we are, below where we are now, that trees that have of the same species but have naturally evolved with a warmer, drier climate to provide some of that resilience. Outside of the nature recovery network, well, pretty much anything's been a goer on there, but we've got things, obviously we have things like Cladicea that go in. We've got all the different flowering cherries, and what else we used? Hibiscus. We do put sweet gum in. We've got different species of limes that we would use instead of the hybrid lime. We've got different alders, a range of different oak species. I was just trying to think. I mean, we've got something like 130 something odd species from 84 families across the city. So yeah, I mean, anything really that has a more simple type flower, a proper flower, or catkin type flowers, is going to be beneficial to pollinator insects at some point in the year, whether they're early flowering. So the early catkins that come through on some species are going to be good for those early bee species that are coming out, while the flowering species are later on. It's all about making that mix. I think if you go through, books from companies like Hilliers and Barcham's and the TDAG Tree Selectors Guide, they give a good indication as to whether they've got a wildlife value as well. But the double flowered varieties of things like some of the cherries are not particularly good for pollinators, because they're either sterile or the pollinators aren't able to get to the stamens in there to get the pollen and nectar. So
thank you for that. Question here about funding. What is your main source of funding for street trees?
Okay, so at the moment, that's built into our highways contract. So the city funds the replacement of highway trees for the whole. So for everyone that's we have to take out, we've got a direct replacement going back in, and that's maintained as part of that contract. Where we are having additional trees put in, where we're looking at changes in the highway layout, those are usually funded through that project basis. For example, we've just been doing some work with Transport for West Midlands as well. So part of the Combined Authority, looking at putting a new rapid transit system in Sprint. As part of that, we had to have some tree removals done, and what they did was they committed to create a net gain in canopy cover at 10 years post implementation. So they've planted, I think we removed on the whole, across the whole length of it, something around like 300 trees, which sounds an awful lot, but it was a long distance. We've looked at the species composition, and then they've planted, I think it's like around 1,500 trees as part of that, and establishing them. So that's funding through other schemes, so national transport schemes. I think moving forward, we'll probably start to look at some of the potential for sponsorship as well, because I know some local authorities are working on sponsorship schemes for street trees. And that's something I think we need to pick up on. But yeah, at the moment it's through transport projects and making sure that we've got sums allocated in those project budgets.
Thanks, Simon. I'm just conscious of time. I know we've gone over a little bit. There are a few more questions. Are you okay if we just ask a couple more? Is that all right? Thank you.
Yeah.
So one here, or in fact two, around mapping. Are you able to share how you created your mapping? Was this done internally or with a consultant? Simon, what is the predictive mapping tool that you use? Is it available to everybody?
Okay, so pretty much all the data sets that we used were available internally, because we either purchased them or we had licensing, or they're open source data. So things like the ONS data, Office of National Statistics data, was there. The mapping software that we were using actually comes from a company called Planet Geo. So it's part of the Tree Plotter software, and this was their Tree Plotter canopy tool. So we actually worked with them to import all the data layers. They did all the little bits of GIS, jiggery pokery with the algorithms to actually give us that interactive map basis. So to be honest with you, it's actually the license is owned by our tree warden group. So they were able to access some external funding through a project. So that's paid for us to have that mapping for the next 5 years. And then hopefully we'll be able to just fund that going forward and make sure we update that. So that's how we've funded that mapping.
Thank you. How are you encouraging members of the public to engage with this plan and be involved with tree planting in the city, and sort of also similarly involving the public? Are you encouraging householders to green up their own gardens or remove hard standing?
Okay, so I think I've started to allude to that there. So actually, we have a tree warden group. It's called Birmingham Tree People, which were very much integral part of delivering our urban forest master plan. In fact, it was co-created with them. They actually had the lead on this. So it's been involving the community through all of that process. The mapping that we've got is, well, parts of the mapping is available on the websites that the Birmingham Tree People have, so people can engage with it there. Over the past decade or so, we've planted 100,000 trees plus, all with community groups. So involving the community in all of these stages has been key to us all along. But yes, getting people to green their own spaces, that's a difficult one. Something that we're just about to start an Urban Forest Accelerator pilot in partnership with the National Trust, Woodland Trust and Community Forest Trust. Part of that is about how we engage with individuals to retain the greenness that they've got in their gardens, and sort of how can we encourage them to plant a tree in their garden? What can we do to encourage them? How can we engage with those communities who need trees most and get them in their garden spaces? I think if we said we got something like 450,000 households in the city, if we could engage with 10% of those to plant a medium-sized tree in their garden, that would probably take us about 25% of the way to our urban canopy cover goals, an increase, so that they can going to play a sort of a significant role in that. So yeah, difficult one to do, but one we're going to have to tackle. So I don't have an answer yet.
Thanks, Simon. Coppice of existing woodland has both biodiversity and carbon sequestration benefits. Is this part of your plan?
It certainly will be as part of our local nature recovery strategy. We've got 1,390 something hectares of woodland already within the city. A lot of that is within the bigger parks, so Sutton Park, Woodgate, Lickey, and the like. A lot of those are also semi-natural ancient woodlands. So we need to be looking about how we can bring those into better management to provide a better variety of habitats in there. There's been a distinct lack of resource, really, I suppose, to deliver that. But yeah, we need to be engaging with communities more in getting them more actively involved in the management of those, and looking at how we can, like I say, use things like biodiversity net gain to fund the active management of these sites. So we'll be part of that, because we need to preserve these woodlands for as long as possible.
Do you actively replace street trees that are located in tree pits to maintain ecological connectivity and provide those benefits such as shade, etc., where urban trees are most needed?
So, sorry, Caroline, can you just say that one again?
Yeah. Do you actively replace street trees that are located in tree pits to maintain ecological connectivity and provide those benefits such as shade where urban trees are most needed?
Okay, so it depends whether you mean what you mean by a tree pit. I suppose if we're talking about looking at trees, if we look at the general highway network, we've got areas of soft verge, we've got hard landscaping, hard landscape verges. So yes, we're primarily be putting trees back into those highways verges, the soft landscape areas, but we do have a process of either reutilising pits in hard paved areas or creating a new pit. If we're looking at development and how we're tying into those now, we're definitely looking towards having constructed tree pits with minimum rooting volumes of uncompacted soils. So we would definitely be putting back into those, because those were the places that we can get them back into. So yeah, we do sort of go back into those areas, or as close as possible, given the fact that new utilities and stuff will have come in. But
Thank you. Couple of questions here about stock, seed stock or sapling stock. Have you engaged in the National Tree Seed Stock project currently running? Have you engaged with the National Arboretum to secure more unusual whip and sampling stock?
the answer to that at the moment is no, not yet. Capacity, I mean, any of those if you're out there working for local authorities, I'm sure capacity is a big issue. We have a massive amount of stuff on our plate, and as you probably picked up from my title, I do both ecology and arb, so there's a lot of work on my plate at the moment. But it's those sorts of things that we'd be wanting to pick up on. So yeah, looking at, can we encourage, or can we make sure that we've got space for and start things like community tree nurseries, local seed gathering. I think it's going to be a good way of helping supplement some of the trees that we need. Whether it will be sufficient for the numbers that we might need in some locations, I don't know, but we can see how we go. But yeah, certainly looking at engaging with those, and like I say, the arboretum type things for more unusual trees, trialing those out, because I think as we see changes in the urban environment, we know that we're getting days that are frost free. So can we start to plant some of those more tender species that we wouldn't normally see in this area to provide that additional biodiversity? And there was a question, I think, also that I saw about productive trees. So yes, we have a lot of engagement with community groups who are planting orchards around the city. So there is productive landscape tree planting going on out there as well.
A couple of questions around planning, and I guess it's that balance between all the different responsibilities that a local authority has. There's a large green open space of woodland, for example, in Chelmsley Wood, surrounded by housing on all sides. Due to pressure to build affordable housing on some of it has been cut away and used for housing. How does that square with trying to obviously increase canopy cover? There's another question. Someone's put an interesting link in the Q&A, and it's something I've seen previously. Milan, there are some tower blocks in Milan that have an awful lot of green. Have you considered anything like that to try and address that balance between the need for housing stock and the need for
Okay, so first of all, Chelsea Woods. That's fortunately or unfortunately, that's in Solihull, so I'd have to deal with that one so much. But I think it's an interesting one because you know, certainly I've seen sites that the city don't own, that somebody's bought at auction, they've cleared trees from it, and you think actually that constituted a piece of woodland. I think looking at the Environment Act and the need for biodiversity net gain, there's more of a penalty, I suppose, in some respects, for developers who come along and clear trees preemptively, because the assessment will be that if there was woodland there, it's going to be presumed to be in good quality. So they'll have to work really hard to put that back and provide net gain benefit. So there'll be more emphasis on them actually getting quality information in terms of condition assessments prior to any types of work on there. I think, you know, woodland is a particularly hard habitat to replace. So I think it is all down to that quality and what's there. I mean, to be honest, I'd rather see, you know, woodland blocks retained and not nibbled away at. We should be using that space to create more of a buffer between the more sensitive woodland and the development in that respect. So yeah, it doesn't sit well with us. It certainly wouldn't sit well in terms of our tree policies. And then in terms of things like Milan, then yes, we've seen things like Bosco Verticalia and stuff like that. We are starting to see, you know, smaller tree planting on podium roofs. If you start to look at some of the work around the city's Our Future City plan, the graphics in there show trees all over buildings. I think if we get a percentage of that, we're doing well. I think there are some issues in terms of ensuring we've got suitable rooting volume, stability of trees, etc. But I think we will be seeing more greening of urban buildings, especially as we're looking to, you know, increase the density within the city centre, and we need to be creating adapted livable spaces for those populations. So that urban greening is going to be critical, whether it's trees, shrubs, herbaceous perennials, etc. I think it's going to be a mix of all of those.
That's great. Thank you very much, Simon. I'm conscious of time. I think we'll have to draw a line to it here. Thank you, everybody, for joining us. Apologies if we didn't get to your question. I think we've gone through quite a lot of them, but hopefully you have found the session helpful. As I mentioned before, we will be sharing the slides and the recording afterwards. So thank you once again for joining us, and thank you, Simon, for coming along as well. Thank you, everybody.
Thanks all.